tougher when you're presenting to what you feel like is an empty room, so it's nice to know that you're there. All right, looks like Zuri's here. Everyone's ready to go. So I'm going to jump back into the presentation, and I will pop back in as necessary. All right, so I'm going to screen share again with you guys. All right, so moving forward in the basically those 5 points, we're going to jump into the first one, and that is each person responds differently to a training program. And this is where genetics plays a huge factor in how you respond to exercise. So there are 3 categorized body types, and these are exceptionally simplified. So please do not think that by any means you're going to always fall into one category, but there is some good clinical research that suggests if you are able to identify most closely with one of these 3 body types, it's going to sort of dictate how you would want to train and recover. So most people have heard about these. You got mesomorph, ectomorph, and endomorph. They're not new ideas. And the original basis for them was relatively poorly delineated in research. But in recent years, they've broken these down into basically kind of summaries of generalizations and have done some studies on metabolic rate and recovery within each group. And there's some pretty good validity to it. So what that means for you guys is if you can identify with a group, sort of a body type of your own, you actually can use that window, that information to your advantage. So mesomorphs are the athletic physique. Mesomorphs include people with really broad shoulders, narrow waist and hips. Generally, they're pretty muscular looking, and they have pretty low body fat. Generally, there's a faster metabolic rate in these people. So these are sort of the stocky builds. Those of us that tend to be a little bit stronger and just maintain that muscle mass easy, we are more mesomorphic. Ectomorphs are really the sort of skinny runner looking body type. They're narrow shoulders, narrow hips, really long and lean legs and arms. It tends to look like a smaller bone structure initially, and they have very little body fat. And endomorphs are a larger majority of us, and that's the athletic physique for an endomorph is a wide hips and narrow shoulders. This is that pear shape that you see in a lot of women. We tend to have less muscular definition. There's a little bit of an uneven fat distribution in this population, and it mostly accumulates in our upper arms, buttocks, and thighs. We have actually a wider bone structure, which is great because it is usually an indication of higher bone density and less likelihood of fracture. But there is a slower metabolic rate than the other 2 body types, so that may change how we train. So we're going to break down these 3 now. All right, so for the mesomorphs out there are some advantages. You respond well to most types of training, and you do build strength very well and generally very efficiently. Disadvantages of being a mesomorph: you are not naturally bendy. Flexibility does not come easy for you because stability does. So it takes a little more focus. Mesomorphs are really at risk for overtraining because they often miss body cues and forget to incorporate rest. Since mesomorphs are naturally really strong, they don't tend to feel the muscular fatigue that the other 2 groups do. So they tend to push through delayed onset muscle soreness and overtrain. And for mesomorphs, stagnation occurs very quickly in training programs, and they need to progress conditioning and flexibility often so that they don't plateau. So if you're one of those people that's very muscular and you tend to sort of hit walls quickly in your training, you may be mesomorphic in nature. Tips for you mesomorphs: rest days are key. And often for this group, more than 1 a week is essential. I identify with the mesomorphs, so I tend to take 2 to 3 rest days a week, which sounds crazy, even when I say it out loud now, because I used to try to train 5 to 7 days a week. But I actually have made more gains as an athlete with an increase in rest days, so keep that in mind. You want to incorporate stretching and light cardio often in your routine to stay well-rounded, and that's going to help with flexibility and mobility in these athletes. You want to modify and change your training program every 4 to 6 weeks to ensure that you don't plateau. So you want to make sure you've got some, either help from a coach or help from a friend, or you're doing some research on your own to make sure you're doing exercises beyond just pole training to challenge your body and challenge yourself. And theoretically, this group should actually train full body workouts. You don't need to split things into an arm and leg day. And the reason for this is you actually want to have more rest days. So if you did arms and legs days with training, or if you were incorporating sort of more workouts throughout the week, you're not getting that full day of rest. So this group can actually work out more on one day, have a longer session, a couple more time, maybe a couple hours on the pole, and then take a day off rather than break it into 30 minutes on the pole every day. All right, for the ectomorphs, the advantages of being this group is you drop weight easily, and you generally have a great cardiovascular reserve. So you guys are not the ones that are winded at the end of a pole routine. You tend to have a lot more, cardiorespiratory fitness, so you can just go and go and go. Disadvantages: it's really hard to put on muscle mass, and you're prone to injury because of that lower body mass, and there's actually potential for lower bone density. In this group, there's a possibility of unhealthy low body fat levels if you're not eating enough, so that's going to increase your injury risk as well. For the ectomorphs, you want to incorporate weight training into your program. Higher weight, lower reps. So you actually want to start trying to bulk up. Please don't overdo the cardio. It's not necessary. And you want to eat. So if you're in this group, congratulations. It is time to just, never be hungry. You want to ensure adequate protein and carbohydrate levels. You want to have a higher caloric intake. And you always want to maintain these things because you want to make sure you're building muscle since it's harder to do, and you want to prevent injury. All right, for the endomorphs, which again is the largest of the populations, especially in women, the advantage is you already have the curves, so that's great, especially for pole. Your body has a caloric and muscle reserve, so you're less likely to have overtraining injuries than somebody who's a mesomorph or an ectomorph. Disadvantages for this group, it can be harder to quote unquote tone up as you retain fat mass. It's not easily lost. And sometimes you'll feel bulky even with diet or exercise. It can be very frustrating for some people. So please don't let it upset you. It's part of the process. Joint injuries can be more common in this group. And that's usually just because of higher body mass, especially fat mass to muscle mass. So we're talking with falls. So this is not necessarily something you worry about if you're not falling, but you are a group that you want to make sure you're padding the floor when you're training. So tips, focus on power and strength training. You want to raise muscle mass and resting metabolic rate by doing a lot of weightlifting. And that's going to assist in burning calories. So that's going to overcome that sort of desire to hold on to the muscle bulk. You want to cross train. So you want to do cardio and strength. So rather than sitting on the elliptical or the bike, you want to do something called high intensity interval training, which is basically a combination of strength exercises with some cardio. If you have questions about it, I can answer them later. But if you Google high intensity interval training, you're going to find a lot of options out there. It's become a very big part of fitness in the past 10 years. And you actually want to eat often. So small meals, and you want to avoid starchy and sugary foods. If you focus on protein intake, that's going to allow for faster strength gains, less joint injury, and it actually is going to help change your metabolic rate over time. All right, so that's the general gist of basically body types and thinking about training. Kind of pause, look at the discussion, and see if there's any big questions that have come up. Make sure you guys are still doing okay. All right, perfect. Back in, we're going to jump into the second point. This is probably one of the most important things I'm going to talk about in this presentation. This is a really vague sort of issue for a lot of people. You're told to take a rest day. Well, what does that mean? And is it really just one day? Is it half a day? What does it need to be for you? So the magnitude of the physiological or performance gain is related to the size and length of your recovery window. And what this basically means is if you use your recovery window well and you recognize how long it needs to be, you will get stronger than if you ignore it or you push through it. So a recovery window is basically the amount of time it takes for your body to rebuild muscle and be ready to train again. It's genetic, unfortunately, so it's not entirely in your control. It does change as we age. There are some studies that suggest it may get longer as you get older. So yes, you may have to recover longer in your 30s than you did in your 20s, in your 40s than you did in your 30s. And in your 70s, you might take a little longer than you did in your 50s. So it's okay to get older, but you need to make sure you're paying attention to what your body's telling you. We also see longer recovery windows during periods of new skill acquisition. So if you are training new skills and you're working to add difficulty to your repertoire, you're going to see a longer recovery window after class. It's going to take more time for your body to rebuild muscle. It's going to take more time for you to build motor patterns and motor programs of those new skills. When this compares to, say, for example, you're training routines over and over again, which is a repetitive nature, and you've already gained those skills, you actually don't need as much time between routine training. So if you're in performance season or you're showcasing often, you don't need as much recovery as somebody that's really trying to basically build up their skill sequencing and their repertoire and pole. The recovery window length is related to the timing of DOMS. So DOMS stands for delayed onset muscle soreness. So when you're sore and how long you're sore is your best indication of how much recovery you need, specifically for those muscle groups in that area of training. So if you're sore for, between 24 and 36 hours after you train and you feel great by 48, you have a shorter recovery window. You're somebody that tends to build muscle mass quickly and effectively. And that's okay. That's a great thing. You also may be somebody that doesn't build flexibility quite as quickly. So there is a downside to that. If you're sore between 36 and 72 hours after training, you have a longer recovery window. So you're somebody that may need to take breaks or do different types of cross training on those days to ensure that you're getting the most out of your rest and recovery. So how do you maximize this window? You want to listen to your body. So when you feel muscle soreness, that's indicating there was microtrauma done to muscle fibers. And this is totally normal. This is how muscles get stronger over time. but only if we allow them to rest and do so. So I want to talk a little bit about this process so you better understand it. Exercise is going to challenge muscle fibers. When that happens, you have these small tears in the actin and myosin fibers, which are within muscle cells. And that like tearing process is basically your body working as hard as it can to say lift your body onto the pole. You're going to notice that if you are not sufficiently strong, your muscle fibers are going to start to break down as the process of training goes on that day. And when that occurs, there is inflammation within the cell. So satellite cells are basically these little repair cells that sit off on the peripheral of your muscles at a microscopic level, and they're stimulated by this inflammation that occurs after these tears. So immediately, even during your first couple hours post-training, they go to work acting on repairing those muscles. So they add actin and myosin, and this basically beefs up the current muscle cells. The goal being to make them tougher and more capable of lifting the weight or moving yourself next time. In order for this to occur, protein is required, as is adequate calorie intake. So after training, it's really important that you're eating and you're taking in some calories. You're not training and then going and sitting at a desk for 7 hours and not eating anything. You want to make sure you're getting some protein probably within the first hour or two after a pole class. And once this process is completed, the inflammation is going to go away. So you're going to feel the muscle soreness subside. So the entire duration of DOMS, that sort of soreness you feel the day after or 2 days after training, that's when this hypertrophy is occurring. During that window, muscle size and strength is actually going up. And that leads to 2-3 days later, you have actually the ability to perform bigger and better pole skills because your muscle strength is better. Your muscle size is larger. Now we're not talking, big, weight training, sort of power lifter muscles, but rather there is a small microscopic change in muscle size that's going to give you more efficiency. So what if you train hard again during this window of soreness? What happens then? And this is something that's really hard to appreciate until you know the microscopic changes that are occurring. So if your body isn't allowed to repair the muscle cells with adequate time and go through this process of adding actin and myosin, what's going to happen is your satellite cells are going to add collagen instead. Collagen is a really phenomenal sort of rubbery type tissue that is non-contractile. Obviously, it's what gives our skin tone. It's what keeps us looking young. But it doesn't add strength because it can't contract like actin and myosin. So it doesn't actually increase force generation like the normal muscle fibers. Rather, it simply holds the cells together. So think of it as almost like duct tape. It's not going to fix the hole in the raft, but it is going to keep the raft from sinking. The raft is not actually stronger for it. It's weaker over time, but it does basically get you through the day. So when you see this addition of collagen to muscle cells, this is what PTs refer to as the building of scar tissue or the addition of muscular adhesions. And this is going to, over time, make a muscle weaker. So muscle cells don't get stronger, they get bigger, but they get weaker. And if you were to look at a muscle cell under a microscope, and they've done multiple studies that have done this, where you are comparing athletes that took recovery time versus high-level athletes that basically performed or trained every day, they're going to have more of what's called white striations in their muscle fibers. And those white striations are basically patches of collagen. So if you compare the muscle strength of somebody that's got basically white striated additions in their muscle cells to someone who doesn't, the muscle cells are weaker pound for pound than somebody that has taken the appropriate rest time. So what's really fascinating about this is studies have shown that if you train too often and you ignore your recovery window too often, your body learns that this is your normal. So instead of trying to rebuild actin and myosin, this lack of rest becomes habitual and your body just puts down collagen. So you may notice that you're not as sore for as long, but you're noticing that you're not getting stronger. So all of a sudden in the middle of training, you feel like you're pushing yourself harder and harder, but you're getting weaker and weaker. And then all of a sudden now you have pain when you train, and now you have pain at rest. And that's because the muscles that used to be able to lift you, because every cell within that muscle was working, now have a large number of cells that don't contract, they just hold place. So you end up with tight upper traps or tight shoulders. And you end up feeling like you can't train as hard as you used to. Now that's when you got to see a PT. The good news is you can reverse this process because you can break down scar tissue and adhesions with rolling, releasing, cross-friction massage. But if you can avoid building them in the first place, you're actually going to make your body better at building muscle mass because actin and myosin will be the go-to, not collagen from those satellite cells. In here. And make sure that everyone is still with me. Back up, sorry, skipped a page. All right. Sorry, lost we are here. All right. All right, everyone doing okay so far? Perfect. All right, so lost my stop sharing again here. Bring myself back out, make sure everything's going okay. All right. Everyone doing okay? Everyone can see me all right? Anyone have any questions about any of that? All right, so I got a few here. Soreness and drinking soreness. So does drinking a lot of water and recovery drinks after training reduce the recovery window? So absolutely. It doesn't necessarily reduce it. There's no studies that suggest it can shorten the timeline, but it does give your body the nutrients and the cellular fluid needed to speed up and get more efficiency of the process. So you're not necessarily going to cut days off recovery, but you are going to improve the ability of your body to heal. So you're going to get the most out of your recovery. And then let's see. So generally the sort of like the research is showing that it doesn't necessarily matter what you drink. So if you're going to supplement with like a recovery drink versus water, unless you're deficient. So like adding BCAAs and things like that may or may not help speed things up. If you're deficient, yes. If you're not deficient, you've got good nutrition through a regular diet, no. So usually I tell people if you get a lot of more muscle cramping while training, you want to make sure you're getting recovery drinks like, Gatorade, Powerade, something with electrolytes in it. But if you don't have a lot of muscle cramping while training, water by itself is going to be good enough. And then as far as like, again, supplementing with things like magnesium, potassium, sodium, only if you're deficient are you going to see a change in this. So there's the amount of magnesium, amount of potassium and sodium. Really, to know, you'd almost have to go and do a CBC or a blood panel with a doctor to find out like percentage of deficiency. Generally, most like vitamins and daily vitamins and like nutritional supplements are only going to help you if you're missing something, and if you aren't missing it, you're just going to basically urinate it back out. So there's not a ton of danger in supplementing with a general vitamin or general recovery drink, as long as you're not ending up with high levels of something in your bloodstream because of any systemic issues with processing that nutrient. But again, that's something that you'd need, information from a primary care if you're missing things. And then a question about soreness. How do you know you're sore? So you're going to know you're sore if you feel basically stiffness post-training, if you feel an achiness at rest that gets a little better with movement. The amount of soreness is going to be indicative of how much rest you need. So if you're a little sore the day after training and by like noon, the soreness is gone, even after prolonged periods of sitting, you probably can train that evening, that afternoon. If you notice that you're still feeling kind of stiff and achy, you're going to want to push training off to the next day when that soreness and stiffness is gone. It's not necessarily pain. So some people feel less soreness than others, but what you want to check in is how's your range of motion. So say I did a lot of like shoulder mounts and I'm, checking my range to see if I've gained back mobility. How's my neck move that day? Can I get my arms behind me? Or am I able to effectively stretch the muscles that were sore to get back some of that loss of motion? And do I have to constantly stretch, or just as a few simple movements alleviate it? If I'm constantly stretching, I'm still sore. I probably should wait. If a little bit of movement alleviates it and nothing comes back, it's probably okay to train. So hopefully that helps kind of give you a baseline for soreness. All right, jumping back in. All right. So the amount of physiological adaptation depends on the effectiveness of the exercise prescriptions used, which is basically a fancy way of saying if you're doing the right stuff, you get stronger. If you're doing the wrong stuff, you don't. How and what you train matters. So in order to see gains, you have to challenge your muscles and you have to educate your muscular system. So you want to train skills and sequences that are challenging. If it's hard to do, it's worth doing. And then you want to bolster that training with strength and flexibility work that's not on the pole, because cross-training actually matters. It's one of the reasons your body is going to get better and more efficient compared to somebody that only trains on the pole. So if I had to give a generalization as a recommendation from a PT standpoint and from a coaching standpoint, I would say train hard on the pole 2 to 3 days a week, and then off the pole 1 to 2 times a week with resistance work and weight training work that targets muscle groups that you're using in a specific skill sequence. And this is when having a good coach or doing some research on your own helps a lot. There's a lot of great information out there, one with coaches, but two in some of the books that are being published on the subject. They're new and upcoming. One of my favorites is basically Strength and Conditioning for Pole that just came out. And that, let me make sure I've got all the information about that one here. That's by Neola Wilby, and she's done a phenomenal job outlining in that book how you break down some of the skills that you're doing with some muscles. There's also some great online resources, and obviously, there's phenomenal coaches out there on Instagram, on social media that you can reach out to too. But if you're working in a studio, talk with your coach. Specifically, the instructor in your class, if you're struggling with a skill, ask them what muscles you're using. And hopefully they'll be able to give you some information. And then what you can do is basically Google search those muscles for some strength and resistance training, or seek out a really good PT or somebody locally that can help you to sort of break down what areas you might be weak in. If you train off the pole and you really focus on muscle conditioning, you're going to see immediate gains on the pole without the risk of overtraining, without the risk of injury. So that's really helpful. All right, so the last topic we're going to talk about relative to like adaptations to training and recovery is basically neurological adaptations to training. And so how you change your brain and how you change your nervous system is going to make your recovery more efficient. So generally we see increases in strength really short term, and that happens in the first 4 weeks of doing something new. This is actually not muscle strength training or hypertrophy that we talked about. This is basically a connection in the brain becoming more efficient. And the way I describe this is, imagine you're walking through the woods and you decide to make a brand new path. So you're walking through the weeds the first time through to get from point A to point B. The more often you walk that path, the less weeds there are because you've trampled them down. Over time, you basically create a trail in the woods. And the more often you use the trail, the easier it is to find the trail. It happens in reverse too. If you stop walking on that trail in the woods, the weeds come back and it's harder to find it again. This is how neurological adaptations work in training. So the more often you train a sequence or a skill, the easier that skill becomes, not just because of strength gains, but because your brain becomes efficient at using the appropriate muscles to do the skill. And this is why, for example, they say once you learn how to ride a bike, you never forget, because you basically created this very strong neural adaptation and that balance required to ride a bike. So even if it's 20 years later, you can still get back on a bike and you may be a little shaky, but you'll build back that sequence much more quickly. So neural adaptations that we talk about include 3 things: improved synchronization of muscle, so meaning muscles fire together, which is great because the more muscles working together, the more efficiency you have with movement. There's an improved ability to recruit muscles quickly. So rather than have to think about what you're doing, there's a much more like subconscious activation of muscle. And this is what happens when you become, sort of a master at a skill, or you become more advanced in your craft. You can just do a skill without thinking about it. Your body knows what to do and it goes on autopilot because it's basically recruited muscles automatically and in the perfect order, which is awesome. And then you also see improved efficiency of activation. And what this means is your body uses only the muscles needed, not every muscle. And this is something that we've all experienced. When we're training a new skill, you'll notice initially that not only are you huffing and puffing and grunting like crazy to get your hips up over your head, you feel like you've used everything from like finger muscles to like pelvic floor muscles to your diaphragm, honestly, to your facial muscles. I have had days after training where like my jaw was sore because I was clenching my teeth inadvertently. And this is really common. When you don't know how to build a muscle pattern, your body throws everything in the kitchen sink at that skill. So the more efficient you become with this adaptation, this neurological training adaptation, the less overuse you're going to see. So that's really important from a recovery standpoint, because if you're using only the muscles necessary, you need less recovery. So neural adaptations are really the basis of skill acquisition and skill maintenance, and that includes during periods of rest and time away from pole. And this is why sometimes if you are on pole too often and then you suddenly have to take a break, say you got to go travel across country for a wedding in pre-COVID times, and you're out of the studio for like a week, week and a half, you may notice the first couple of days back in the studio, you're actually doing better than the days that you were in studio consistently. And that's because neural adaptation over time maintains skills for you. Neural adaptation requires repetition and recovery for maximizing the benefit of it. So what you need to do is you need to habituate to the process and reinforce the pathway, meaning you got to do the skill over and over and over and over, but then you need to take some time away to convert that program into something concrete and retrievable. So think of this as basically short-term versus long-term motor memory. For anybody that's ever studied for an exam or tried to learn new material that's focused on something academic, and you've crammed the night before, there's this window where you may be sitting down taking this test at 8 a.m. that your brain sees the page you studied, but can't recall the material on the page. Your brain tells you exactly where it was, what was above it, and what was below it, but there's this big blank space where you needed information to be. And that's because you're transitioning information from short-term to long-term memory. This actually occurs with motor programs as well. So if you were training a new skill and you train really hard on Monday, Tuesday, and you come back on Wednesday and you can't do the skill at all, it could be 1, muscle soreness and muscle remodeling, or 2, your brain is trying to convert that motor program into something more long-term, and right now you can't access it. So it's literally in a processing window unavailable to you. So the fun part of neural adaptation is if you train something and over, repetition during 1 or 2 training sessions, and then you give yourself a week off and you come back to it, you're actually going to be better after that week than you were the day you left it. So these changes are why we perceive strength gains early in a new program. And that's despite the muscles not actually having undergone that strength and growth size yet. So it's kind of neat. Neural adaptations to training are one of the reasons you can train routines over and over again before a performance and get better at the routine. It's because you're bringing in that efficiency of movement rather than strength, and your brain is now able to make that routine more subconscious. So neural adaptations happen best when we do 3 things consistently. So repetition, focus, and visualization. Repetition, you want to do the same skill over and over and over. Now, be cautious with this. I'm not telling you to do the skill until you physically break down. I'm telling you to do the skill in repetition so that your body basically gets sort of inundated with repetition of movement. So it practices walking through that pathway in the woods over and over and over. Then you want to focus, because the more conscious thought you bring into this, think of mindfulness while training, the better that pathway is going to be built. So you want to make sure you're in the moment. When you're doing a skill, you want to try to tune everything out. So if you're doing, say, for example, an iron X, so that's what you're working towards, you want to focus on what are you feeling on the pole? What are you feeling in your hands? What are you feeling in your arms? What's going on in your torso? Really pay attention to what's happening with your body, because all that information that you're consciously bringing back to your brain is allowing the brain to process movement better. So it's going to be more efficient at building a program. It's also going to be more efficient at bringing nutrition to the right muscles to shorten recovery. The third thing is visualization. So when you're not on the pole, AKA you're taking a rest day, your brain should be on the pole. You can visualize the skill or sequence over and over while you're not working out. This is something that's been around and really pushed in high-level athletics since the 60s and 70s. But this is probably what I didn't believe in when I was a high-level gymnast in high school and college. I kind of poo-pooed this. I gave no credibility to how to make your rest days more productive by using visualization. So this is something I really want to talk about, because once I started incorporating this into my routines and my training in my 20s, I actually could take weeks of rest between sequences and skills and have a much better performance than I would have if I had not done the visualization. So just some examples for you here. So pole mindfulness is recovery. You're going to want to take rest days, and it's okay to think about pole in those rest days, because your brain doesn't need as much recovery as your body does from a physiological standpoint. So some things to use on those days. So maybe while enjoying a cup of coffee, you rehearse your routine. So you sit there quietly and you visualize every detail from your facial expression to your toe point. You're looking at the goal appearance and the fluidity of the skills. Like, how do you want your routine to look? Don't worry about how it actually looks. Visualizing failure can actually lead to failure. Visualize success. So what do you want this sequence to look like? And don't hesitate. If this is something you're pulling from Instagram or the internet, watch someone that does it beautifully, and then put yourself in their roles. Try to visualize yourself as the first person in that process. Maybe while you're taking a shower, you throw on your routine music. Listen to the beat and focus on the energy and the emotions that you have when you hear the song. What emotions are strongest in the piece? And then consider how you can express those emotions in the skills you've chosen. So really give thought to the performance and sort of the emotional content of that music, because you're going to start bringing in your limbic system and other areas of the brain that actually help reinforce efficiency of neural programming. So by taking up emotion and bringing in energy to these areas, you're actually going to make yourself a better performer. And then one of my favorites is to visualize a skill you're struggling with, and really focus on the mental cues you've been taught by your instructor, and try to walk through the skill in your brain sequentially. So pay attention to where you felt like you struggled on Monday's training session if it's Tuesday and you're taking a day off. Did you have a difficult time engaging your lower core? Could you not get your hips to the pole? Did you feel strain or pulling in your shoulder? Where in your shoulder? What felt like the failure point? Did you feel like you had a strength issue that limited you? Did you feel like it was a flexibility issue? Pay attention to what it is and really think about what your body felt, on these sort of off days, so that when you go back in the studio, you can ask good questions of your instructor, or your body now has brought attention to an area that it needed to basically focus on. And you may notice some of those areas the next time you're in studio are less of a problem, because your brain has worked out some of the problem solving while you were resting. All right. Make sure everyone's going okay. All right. So, a couple things. Yes, this is being recorded, so you guys can rewatch it later. And then for cardio, so incorporating cardio, there's lots of ways to do this. I tend to believe heavily in high intensity interval training over hanging out on an elliptical, because I think that sport specific training is helpful. So I tend to do my cardio as a combination of weight training and a little bit of agility work. So I'll do squats and lunges quickly and then take a rest break versus doing like 30 minutes on a bike and then doing slow squats. So I may try to do what's called high intensity interval training to get more cardio, just because you're going to get some strength and cardio out of it. Theoretically, you can also use cardio as a cool down or a warm up. So if you know that your studio days are Monday, Wednesday, Friday, for example, and Tuesdays and Thursdays you want to make complete rest days, or you want to just do flexibility, you can actually incorporate cardio into your pole days. You just need to find out how your body best responds to it. Some people do better with cardio as a warm-up because it's going to bring attention to the muscles and improve circulation. So they're going to be more efficient in their pole training if they use cardio before. So they might do 20 minutes of walking, 20 minutes of elliptical, 15 minutes of light running before studio. Other people actually will find that that's going to make them too tired and they're going to not have as great a pole training session. So you may want to then incorporate cardio as cool down. So doing it after training. Now this actually plays into a little bit like what's your body type. If you're an ectomorph, you probably will like cardio before pole because your body is naturally like very good at cardiorespiratory fitness. So by bringing your heart rate up and getting circulation through your muscles, you're improving your brain's awareness of what your muscles are doing. So you actually will gain strength if you train physically after doing cardio. If you are an endomorph or a mesomorph, you may prefer to do cardio after because your muscles are so strength-based and you're not as strong with cardiorespiratory endurance. You could actually fatigue yourself if you do too much cardio beforehand. So that would be the population that I'd say stick your cardio either after or on a rest day. There is no such thing as bad cardio. There is such a thing as too much. And if you're like me, you probably don't like it anyway. So chances are you're not doing too much. But be wary. If you're overdoing it, you're burning too many calories on cardio and you're not giving yourself the proteins necessary. So one more question. So 5 days per week on the pole, is that too much? It depends on your body type. So it actually could be. I used to try to incorporate training and coaching 6 to 7 days a week. And my skill progression personally was tanking. It's really hard if you're a teacher. I totally see that. So what you may want to do is try to teach with less demonstration. And this is really difficult for a lot of instructors, myself included, because we tend to want to use demonstration to show visual learners how to do things on the pole. But what I started doing was incorporating demonstration into some days of coaching and not others. So I would, try to minimize my demonstration on my training days and then train heavy before coaching if I was able, and then coach with less demonstration or minimal demonstration. And then on the days that I wasn't training, my goal was to not demonstrate at all. So I would either try to, use like video or bring up other students that had some of the skills I was trying to teach. Or I would do a little more like coaching of groundwork and flexibility in those off days. So it does take a little bit of practice, and it may be that you have to work with your studio to sort of choose which classes you're coaching on which days to give yourself recovery days. But if you feel like your training is stagnating and you feel like you're having to demonstrate 5 or 6 days a week while coaching, it is probably because you're doing too much demonstration. So it's a tough balance to walk, but if you communicate well with your studio instructor and you kind of know where you're sitting, you'll be able to sort of improve that. That said, there are some people that can train 5 days a week and they have no issues. It usually is more maintenance training. So somebody that's already got routines, already got the skills, and they're just trying to basically hold a baseline. If you're trying to incorporate new, you're going to struggle with gains. Even the most seasoned athlete, 5 days a week may leave you feeling very sort of plateaued. And you may end up having a little bit more pain, a little more injury, a little more of that collagen replacement in your muscle fibers where you just feel stiff, sore, tight, and just not as strong as you think you should be. So, pay attention to that. And then if you have questions about how to ask or talk with studio owners, or, if you want to speak with me later about like personal examples, I'm happy to sort of share my struggles to find balance in coaching and training. All right, heading back to the presentation. So, logical component to training. So your emotional state while training determines your productivity during that session and the rest and recovery window that occurs after. So this is the part that I gave no value to when I was an athlete, because I had this belief that, thinking about emotions and thinking happy thoughts was, frou-frou and not for me. And I wish I could go back and talk to my 18-year-old self and get her to think clearly. Knowing her, she wouldn't have listened, but the idea of time travel still makes me feel better. So negative emotions and anger have actually been shown in multiple clinical studies and fitness studies to increase adrenaline for short-term strength gain. So when you're angry, say, for example, you had a terrible day at work and you want to kill a coworker and you take that anger to the studio, you can just hoist yourself up on the pole, no questions asked, However, the other hormones that are being released, cortisol and norepinephrine, are actually preventing your brain from building a strong motor program. So while you're feeling exceptionally strong that day, you're not going to carry any of that strength or those motor programs over, unfortunately. And this is because you're in fight or flight mode. So your anger at your boss is making you feel like you can, lift a car, but you're not learning how to lift that car twice. You're just lifting a car. So you need to be in learn and grow mode. And to be in that sort of like mental state for learning, you actually have to be calm. So this may be why you may want to do your cardio before training. For example, like 15 minutes of like running, till you, feel like your heart's going to explode may get your adrenaline out so that you can then focus in the training, session in the studio. But, that's always tricky. So on the flip side, a positive state of mind in studies has been shown to improve your gains, especially within neurological adaptations, by improving activation of the motor cortex while working out. So your brain is really fascinating. When you're giving attention to one area, that means that consciously you're not able to give attention to another area. Our brain is really good at basically compartmentalizing. So it is running subconsciously in different places all at once, but it's giving its attention to one area. So say, for example, you're sitting in a crowded restaurant. You're very much able to have a conversation with somebody in front of you without hearing the conversations of everybody around you. And that's because your brain has compartmentalized which area of the brain needs to work to allow you to engage with your friend. Same thing happens when you're training. So if you are, not focused on basically the motor cortex, so the part that's moving you, and you're instead focusing on your limbic cortex, meaning the anger and frustration you felt because your coworker refused to just do the work and instead sent you emails about it all day, your brain is not using the motor cortex to make gains. Rather, it's focusing on the emotional part, the limbic cortex. So that's where the energy is going. If you use that positive state of mind, you're going to shorten your recovery window. So this is actually one way you can decrease the amount of time it takes to recover. And this has been basically proven multiple times in studies. What they've seen is there's an efficiency of the satellite cells, because when you are focused on movement and you're not in fight or flight mode, you have better circulation, you have better redistribution of nutrition. So rather than nutrition being sort of sent everywhere, it's going to be going to the areas you need it. And so that improves the efficiency of satellite cells, and it gives them better access to nutrients and proteins. So you actually start to see muscle remodeling immediately after training. There is a couple studies, and they're really new, and they haven't sort of been done with what's considered the double-blind placebo cross-sectional stuff that we want to see in research. But more case and small longitudinal studies have been done that has shown that people with longer recovery windows, so one of those groups of people that have those like soreness for 72 hours, if they actually stay in a positive state of mind when they're training and working out, their soreness drops from 72 to 48. So they actually recover faster, which means that you could then take less rest time. So if you are able to train in a good state of mind, you actually may be able to shorten your recovery window. And this is in comparison to like studies that have shown, have not shown changes with nutritional supplementation, studies that have not shown changes with like additional vitamins, things like that. So interestingly enough, like changing how you think can actually shorten your recovery time. A positive state of mind is going to improve your energy stores. So it's actually going to help you break down fat and improve carbohydrate metabolism. So too much cortisol in the bloodstream actually cues your body to store fat. And this is an evolutionary problem. For some reason, our brain hasn't gotten through that we're not running around in the Stone Age, like scrambling for food. We have plentiful access to food. So when we kick in the stress hormone of cortisol, our body actually holds on to fat. It shuts down fat breakdown and only uses free floating sugars in the body, which is why after stress, you crash and you're hungry, like really hungry. That's when you sit on the couch and you've gone through every chip in your cabinet and you're still not satisfied because you had a bad day at work. So if you can stay in a positive state of mind while you're training, you're actually using fat stores, and carbohydrate metabolism is slowed down. So you're not going to crash after training. You're actually going to have energy left to rebuild muscle fat, like fibers and muscle mass. So as hard as it may be, try to leave your stressors at the studio door and to enjoy the process of training. And this includes even, on days when all of your training in life goes to shit. So those are the hardest days, but if you can stay in a positive mindset and recognize, well, it's just one of those days, you actually are going to feel better when you leave the studio. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second, look at any questions, and then I'm actually going to kind of talk about some releases you can do. So we've covered the physiology part, and now I really want to break into some, releases and changes, and then give you guys some Q&A. All right, so some of my favorite releases, and maybe you've seen these before, maybe you do these already, which is great, are listed here. And one of the things I like about muscle release work is it brings attention to an area of muscle. So on your rest days, and when I say rest days, I mean days that you're not on the pole, days that you're not strength training, it is absolutely acceptable to do some yoga, go for a walk, do some gentle stretching. And I love muscle release on rest days. And the reason for that is it actually does improve circulation. It can decrease the likelihood of muscle adhesions and improve the sort of reduction of soreness. And it does that by increasing circulation and improving your body's ability to get nutrition to those areas. But what's really cool about releasing a muscle, and this is specifically trigger point release, is it brings attention to the area by increasing the sensory receptors activation at that muscle. So that means it's tuning your brain into what's going on with that area. And what's cool with that is it actually teaches your brain to focus on the spot that you're releasing. So your brain is going to say, kind of do more of a check-in. So it's going to look at all the muscle cells in that area. Are they tight? Are they weak? Are they not getting enough nutrition? What's going on? And the brain's going to try to alleviate any potential problems it comes across. So what it's basically doing is, if you think of a lacrosse ball as basically a highlighter, you're highlighting that muscle group for the brain so that the brain can do whatever it needs to bring it back to a better position or a better level of health. Muscle release work, specifically like trigger point work, actually can decrease sort of collagen synthesis in those areas. So that scar tissue or those muscle adhesions that I talked about that you may get with overtraining, you can actually get a little bit of improvement in that by doing these releases. So this is a list that I know means nothing to you right now because it's not necessarily going to help you since you can't see them. But let me pull this up for you here. So this is the list. Hopefully you guys can see it here. It's just a PDF I have of all the releases, and this is what I'm going to make available to you guys in the download, and I'll also put in the handouts. And it's just a short list of exercises. So basically looking through them, you've got your shoulder releases, everything from infraspinatus to subscap. You've got your neck releases, upper trap, and then you've got your thoracic releases. So in this picture, the ball is high, but you can also take it down low, basically anywhere along the rib cage. And then we've got our psoas, so anterior hip, and glute med, posterior hip. So if you notice you're tight in a particular area, I've kind of outlined whole body options here. You do not need to do all of these, but focus on what's sore. Is it your neck? Is it your shoulder? Is it your hip? And then these 3 exercises are my favorite sort of whole body releases. So seated belly breathing, it's a little bit challenging to figure out, but you're trying to use your knees to block your rib cage so that you actually breathe into your back and to the sides of your back. Most of us are upper chest breathers, and we tend to breathe into like our sternum, which means our upper traps and our scalenes and our neck are always tight. So if we can retrain our body to shift breath, if you think of breath as a bubble, if you can train it to breathe into the shoulder blades, if you can train it to breathe into the low back, if you can train it to breathe in the sides of the ribs, you're actually going to improve your flexibility in these areas and decrease the tightness in your neck over time. So this is really going to help with range of motion in your shoulders. And it's actually going to improve range of motion throughout the spine to give you back some of the bridge and flexibility you're looking for sort of in your back bend and arch moves. I also like cat, cow, and child's pose for this. These are based heavily on yoga, but there's a lot of breathing that occurs. And what you're looking for is trying to focus in while you're doing these exercises on any areas of perceived tightness. So this is that mindfulness part we talked about. If you're doing the arch of the cat, cow, and you feel like there's a pinch between your shoulder blades, think of trying to transition the breath to that area and trying to focus on opening or releasing that as you go through the repetitions. Same thing on this child's pose. You're going to do left and right side. And if you're going to the right, like the picture here, you're going to feel pulling in the left. When you're breathing, you want to breathe into the left side. Force the rib cage to open. Force the lats to let go. Use breath as a stretch. You'll actually see improvements in mobility from doing that. And the good news is deep breathing has been shown to lower cortisol levels and improve focus and mindfulness. So you're going to speed up recovery by doing that as well. So I'm going to show you in the next link here where you can get this presentation. So the website is acropt.com/PoleCon 2020. So real simple, just basically type that in a browser. And then the password is SmartRest, all lowercase, one word. It'll be downloadable at the website throughout the weekend. And then I'm going to figure out how to put this up as a handout throughout the course of the day so you can get it there as well. If you have questions about any of these exercises, I'm going to put my email up on the next screen so you can write that down too. I'm just going to give you a second to write these 2 things down. All right, and then my email directly is aprescott@acropt.com. So you can email me any questions you have about the presentation. If there's something you felt like you really identified with, but you didn't really understand on an intrinsic level, you need specifics, please don't hesitate to write me a question. I love sharing the information. And I'm also happy to, send out a PDF of the presentation. It will be recorded and available for you guys to look at over and over again on the IPIA website. But if you, are looking for specifically just the visual text part, I can send that out. A lot of this stuff is in some of the blog posts we've got on my website, acropt.com. And we do put out content on Facebook and Instagram, so I'm updating this as well. So feel free to check out those. All right, so I'm here for any questions from now until 10. I've really appreciated you guys taking the time to sit with me and go through this. I know it was a ton of material, but I hope it gave you some things to think about and some, control back and recovery and rest, because it's tough to be told you have to take rest days if you don't know how to use them and you don't know how to, sort of theoretically shorten them and pepper them in your workouts in a good way. So I'm going to slide over to discussion panel and answer any questions I have. So. All right. Does anybody need the link? Everyone got the link for downloading the information? Because I can always put that back up. Awesome. Anybody have any specific questions for me? So thumbs up if you guys felt like you got something out of this. It's hard to know, to get feedback. I miss seeing faces. Awesome. I really appreciate it. I look forward to the next time, and I'm really grateful you guys all came. So we actually finished a little bit early. Oh, flexibility training. Cool. That's a great question, actually. So flexibility training, I actually did a whole presentation on that up on our Acro website a couple weeks ago. We have a program called Acro to Go, which is basically this online group of fitness and strength classes targeting pole and aerial athletes. But we did a program called the Physiology of Flexibility. So what's really interesting about flexibility training is flexibility is not actually lengthening of muscle the way that we've been taught for decades. This idea that if you stretch, your muscles get longer. They don't. Your number of muscle cells that are linked within a muscle is static. You actually can't do what's called hyperplasia or addition of muscle cells. You can hypertrophy muscle cells, meaning make them bigger, and you can retrain what's called muscle spindles or muscle sort of neurological apparatus within muscle to allow more flexibility. So stretching and flexibility training is actually entirely based on sensation. So when you stretch, initially you feel pain earlier in the range of motion, and that's when your body cues you, don't stretch further, you could get hurt. If you sit at that position for a period of time, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds, you'll notice that the sensation of stretching drops dramatically, and you can go further. What's really cool about that is you're actually training your brain to allow those receptors to feel less sensation early in motion. So over time, you're allowing the fibers within the muscle cells, that actin and that myosin, to overlap less. So you and I, whether I'm super flexible and you're not, actually have the same mechanical ability to stretch, meaning our muscles can go just as far. What's limiting us is our brain's perception of the sensation of stretch. So if you stretch more often than I do, you actually will become more flexible because you're training your brain to allow the stretch. What's fascinating about this is it actually carries over just like riding that bike. So I was a competitive gymnast as a kid, and then in my late 20s, I got really into PT and my residency and my clinicals, and I dropped off of circus and performance work, and I stopped stretching. So I lost flexibility. But as soon as I started training again back in my early 30s, it came back in lightning speed compared to the original gain. And that's because I trained those neurological receptors, and my brain just had to shake the dust off those pathways. So when you're stretching, if you want to get more flexible, focus on 1, where do you feel the stretching sensation? 2, what does it feel like? Is it painful? Is it a pulling? And try to basically live in that moment and breathe and tell your body, this is just a stretch. This is just a stretch. So this is why ballistic stretching, like kicking fast, doesn't work. Because when you kick fast, you kick on those receptors and you teach them nothing, because it's basically a spinal reflex. It's quick, it's sudden, it doesn't allow you to override it. If you sit in a stretch for a long period of time, you will see gains both during the day, so stretching within a class, and over time if you do it repeatedly. What's really cool is you only need to stretch 2 to 3 times a week for 30 to 40 minutes to see gains. You don't have to sit in splits all day, every day. You just have to be present when you do. So flexibility training on rest days is a great option as long as you are well rested, well hydrated, and you've got good nutrition, because your body is not going to lose the ability to build muscle mass while stretching, but it is going to struggle if you're not getting all the other things in place. So what if someone's coming back to pole from a long hiatus, having a kid? Awesome, great question. I actually have a 1-year-old, so I took a substantial amount of time off while pregnant from aerial and pole and everything. And honestly a substantial amount of time off when he was 6 months and younger because it was impossible to find time or energy to do stuff. Coming back into it, you actually have a couple things to think about. Your body, unfortunately, has permanently changed, which is kind of lame, because it changes your pelvic floor, it changes your abdominals, it changes your ligamentous structure. That permanent change doesn't mean you're necessarily not going to get back to what you used to do, but it means you're going to feel very different while you're training. So a lot of the sensations and skills you used to be able to do aren't going to feel like they used to, especially right afterward, and even as you get further into training, because you're now training with a slightly different mechanical shape. Your hips may be a little wider. You might have a slightly weaker lower core from the pregnancy. And because of like the lack of mobility and the change of pressure on your spine, you're going to notice big losses of flexibility in the back initially. So patience is key with recovering from basically, being out of time after having a kid. So you want to basically introduce things slowly, and you want to introduce things almost sequentially if you have a good instructor from like a basic level back forward. So feel free to rewind your training, start at the baseline and rebuild skills. And you'll see as you do that, it's kind of a perpetual motion machine. Once you get the basics back, everything else starts to kick in. If you're just taking time off, say, for example, because of a pandemic and you couldn't get in the studio and now you're back, but you didn't have a kid, you'll actually notice your recovery from this hiatus is quicker to overcome than when you first started, working out and doing pole and other fitness, related activities. Because again, that riding the bike mentality, you built the neurological programs and you want to bring them back. So if you want to bring them back faster, focus. When you're training, pay attention to what you're doing. Come up with a plan of training, again, building from basic skills to more intermediate and sequential. And there is a rule of what's called 15. When you're increasing weight training or increasing fitness training, you never want to go up by more than 15%, either in weight or duration. So say, for example, you're coming back to pole from, being isolated and no studios being open. You don't want to come back and go from 0 days a week to 5. That does not represent a 15% increase. Theoretically, you'd want to come back to 1, and for a couple of weeks, you'd hang out at 1. Then you come back to 2, and then you'd hang out at 2 for a couple of weeks. Then you'd come back to 3. And what that's giving your body a chance to do is rebuild muscle mass, because hypertrophy, meaning the addition of actin and myosin to make the muscle stronger, works forward, but it also goes in reverse. We lose about 7% of our strength for every week that we are not training, which is like a big deal. Some of that's neurological and some of that's physiological, meaning strength of like actin and myosin. So you don't want to just go from 0 to 60 because you're going to blow past that barrier and you're going to lay down collagen. So take your time and be mindful when you come back into it. But again, sort of that idea of focusing on training and building from like the baseline, you'll see a much quicker return than you did the initial time you were learning the skills. Awesome. Make sure everything else is coming back. All right, I think I've gotten everything. Is there anybody that I missed? Anybody that wants to throw something down that something said, what did we miss in between? I'm not sure how to answer that. I don't know if something slipped out or something in the presentation was left off, but that's really everything. I had a fantastic time working with you guys. I guess, we get it ready for the next session that starts at 9:15. And I look forward to talking with anybody who wants to talk with me privately. I'll kind of hang out, see if I can put myself in a position to answer questions during the panel, or at least through email. So thank you everybody for joining me. This was a blast. I had a nice time presenting, and hopefully I'll see you guys at PoleCon 2021 in person. So thanks everyone. Stay well. Bye.